She needed creative space to explore whether our relationship aligned with her authentic culinary journey, so she asked me to move out for 6 weeks. I said okay and packed that same evening, not knowing she'd already been secretly texting another chef behind my back. I'm Jake, 29 years old, and I work as a software quality assurance tester in Portland, Oregon. I spend my days debugging restaurant ordering systems and mobile apps, making sure the code works perfectly before it reaches customers. It's methodical work that suits me well, finding patterns in chaos and fixing problems that most people never notice until something breaks. My colleagues think I'm detail-oriented to a fault, but I take pride in ensuring that when a customer tries to place an order at midnight, everything functions exactly as it should. The irony wasn't lost on me that I spent my professional life making sure restaurants ran smoothly while my personal life revolved around someone who saw restaurants as stages for artistic expression rather than businesses that needed to function efficiently. I met Luna at a rooftop farmers market in the Pearl District on a sunny Saturday morning 2 years ago. She was crouched beside a vendor's table, photographing artisanal sourdough loaves with the kind of intense focus I usually reserved for tracking down software bugs. Her blonde hair caught the morning light as she adjusted angles, completely absorbed in capturing the perfect shot for her food blog. She wore a vintage sundress and had this way of making the most ordinary things look magical through her camera lens. When she stood up and smiled at me, asking if I knew anything about natural lighting for food photography, I felt something shift inside my chest that I hadn't experienced since college. I ended up spending 2 hours helping her carry equipment and listening to her explain the difference between various heirloom wheat varieties with the enthusiasm most people reserved for discussing their favorite sports teams. Luna was 26, beautiful in that effortless Portland way, and passionate about food in a manner that made everything else seem dull by comparison. She dreamed of opening a farm-to-table restaurant and becoming one of those culinary influencers who traveled the world sampling exotic cuisines and sharing their discoveries with devoted followers. Her Instagram feed was filled with carefully composed shots of colorful dishes, behind-the-scenes glimpses of local chefs at work, and inspirational quotes about following your passion no matter the cost or conventional wisdom. She talked about food the way other people talked about art or music, with this breathless enthusiasm that made even discussing oregano varieties feel profound and important. When she described her vision of introducing people to flavors they'd never experienced before, her eyes lit up in a way that made me want to support whatever she needed to make that happen. I became her biggest supporter without even realizing it was happening. When she mentioned needing better camera equipment to grow her blog and attract potential sponsorships from local restaurants, I quietly researched the best options and surprised her with a professional DSLR that cost me 3 weeks of overtime pay plus my entire bonus from a successful project launch. The joy on her face when she opened that box made every extra hour worth it, and she spent the entire evening showing me how the improved image quality would elevate her content and help her compete with established food bloggers. When her freelance food writing work slowed down during the rainy Portland winter months and sponsored posts became scarce, I covered her share of rent for our trendy loft apartment without making her feel guilty about it. I told her it was temporary, that I believed in her vision, and that every successful person needed someone who supported them through the lean times before recognition arrived. Our relationship felt like the kind of partnership I'd always wanted but never quite found with anyone else. I handled the practical aspects of our life together while she focused on building something creative and meaningful that could eventually support both of us. I paid most of our bills, scheduled our appointments, managed our budget with the same attention to detail I brought to my coding work, and created the stable foundation that allowed her to pursue her culinary ambitions without worrying about mundane concerns like utilities, rent, or whether we had enough savings for emergencies. She brought beauty and excitement into my methodical world, introducing me to hidden restaurants tucked away in converted warehouses and teaching me to appreciate flavor combinations I'd never noticed before in my lifetime of eating without thinking. I learned to distinguish between different types of salt, discovered that there were people who made careers out of perfecting single dishes, and found myself genuinely interested in the stories behind family recipes and traditional cooking techniques. I thought we were building something lasting together, the kind of future where I'd eventually propose with a ring chosen as carefully as I selected everything else in my life, and we'd move to a house in the suburbs with a proper kitchen and a garden where she could grow her own herbs and test recipes for the restaurant she planned to open. Luna often talked about wanting to escape the constraints of ordinary life, to live authentically and pursue experiences that mattered more than stability or conventional success. I admired her refusal to settle for mediocrity, even when it meant our grocery bills were triple what they should have been, because she insisted on organic everything from specialty markets instead of regular stores, claiming that superior ingredients were essential for developing her palate. When she attended exclusive foodie events and pop-up dinners that cost more than I spent on groceries in a week, I encouraged her networking, even though those evenings often meant I ate takeout alone while she built connections in Portland's competitive culinary scene and posted Instagram stories about innovative dishes I couldn't pronounce. I believed supporting her dreams was what love looked like, creating space for someone else to flourish while maintaining the stability that kept our life together functioning smoothly and efficiently, never realizing that she was beginning to see my practical nature as an obstacle to overcome rather than an asset to appreciate. The changes started slowly, so gradually that I convinced myself I was imagining them until they became impossible to ignore. Luna began making subtle comments about my lifestyle being too predictable, too safe, too removed from the vibrant world of culinary innovation she was discovering through her blog work and industry connections. She started comparing me to food industry personalities she encountered at events, people who traveled constantly and lived what she called authentic experiences rather than following conventional paths toward financial security and domestic stability. I first noticed her growing dissatisfaction during a dinner I'd prepared featuring her favorite Thai curry recipe, something I'd spent 3 hours perfecting using techniques I'd learned from watching her favorite cooking videos and sourcing ingredients from the expensive specialty market she preferred. Instead of appreciating the effort or acknowledging the time I'd invested in learning proper knife techniques and spice balancing, she pushed the food around her plate and mentioned how a renowned chef she'd met at a pop-up dinner the previous week created boundary-pushing fusion experiences that challenged people's assumptions about flavor combinations and cultural authenticity. She talked about how this chef didn't rely on traditional recipes but instead created entirely new culinary languages that expressed deeper truths about culture and identity, making my careful recreation of established dishes seem pedestrian and uninspired by comparison. I asked if there was something wrong with my cooking, genuinely concerned that I'd missed some crucial step in the preparation process, and she assured me it was delicious but explained that she was expanding her palate beyond comfort food and familiar tastes toward more adventurous and intellectually stimulating culinary experiences. Her phone started commanding more of her attention during our conversations, buzzing constantly with messages from food industry contacts, restaurant owners, and fellow bloggers who apparently conducted important discussions late into the evening when normal people were winding down from their workdays. She would angle the screen away when responding to texts, claiming it was just boring business stuff about upcoming collaborations and sponsored content opportunities that wouldn't interest me since I didn't understand the complexities of building a personal brand in the competitive food blogging space. When I suggested we planned a weekend trip to explore some of the wineries and farm-to-table restaurants she'd been featuring on her blog, thinking it might help us reconnect while supporting her professional interests, she dismissed the idea as too touristy and predictable, explaining that real food experiences happen spontaneously through insider connections rather than planned itineraries that missed the authentic spirit of culinary discovery. Luna started attending more exclusive events without me, explaining that many were industry-only gatherings where partners would feel out of place among professional chefs, food writers, and restaurant investors who spent their evenings discussing market trends and culinary philosophy rather than making small talk about ordinary topics. She would return from these evenings energized in a way I hadn't seen since we first started dating, her eyes bright with excitement as she described the innovative dishes she'd tasted and the passionate conversations she'd had about the future of sustainable cuisine and ethical sourcing practices. I noticed she began posting cryptic Instagram stories about outgrowing your comfort zone and not settling for ordinary experiences, quotes about following your authentic path even when others don't understand your vision that felt directed at someone specific even though she claimed they were just general inspiration for her followers. Her content became more philosophical, filled with references to authenticity and creative freedom that seemed aimed at justifying decisions she hadn't yet made public but was clearly considering as she evaluated her current situation and future possibilities. The emotional distance between us grew wider each week, creating a space filled with unspoken criticisms and comparisons I wasn't entirely sure I understood but could feel expanding like a chasm that no amount of support or accommodation seemed capable of bridging. When I tried to bridge that gap by showing interest in her work, asking about the chefs she was meeting and the restaurants she was featuring, requesting details about upcoming projects, her responses became increasingly vague and dismissive, as if my curiosity was somehow missing the point of her sophisticated culinary journey. She started using phrases like creative energy and artistic vision when describing her goals, language that made our relationship sound mundane and limiting by comparison, a practical arrangement that was holding her back from fully embracing the transformative experiences that were calling to her from Portland's dynamic food scene. I began feeling like I was failing some test I didn't know I was taking, where my efforts to be supportive were somehow proving that I didn't understand what she needed to grow as a person and professional. Luna's criticism became more direct as winter turned to spring, pointing out how my predictable work schedule and preference for quiet evenings at home were holding her back from fully embracing the opportunities that were opening up in Portland's competitive food scene through her growing network of industry connections. She mentioned how successful food bloggers needed partners who understood the demands of building a brand and maintaining relationships, people who could adapt to the spontaneous nature of culinary events rather than expecting everything to fit neatly into planned schedules. I tried changing my approach, offering to attend events with her and rearranging my work commitments to accommodate her increasingly erratic schedule, but she insisted that I wouldn't enjoy the intense discussions about flavor profiles and restaurant economics that dominated these gatherings. The more I attempted to show flexibility, the more she emphasized how fundamental our differences had become, as if my willingness to adapt was actually proof that I didn't naturally belong in her evolving world of artistic expression and culinary innovation. The conversation that changed everything happened on a Thursday evening in late April, after I'd returned from a particularly stressful day debugging a restaurant ordering system that had crashed during lunch rush at 3 different locations across the city. I'd spent 14 hours straight tracking down a memory leak that was causing payment processing failures, the kind of technical problem that required methodical analysis and patience to solve properly. I was exhausted but satisfied, knowing that thousands of customers would be able to place orders seamlessly because of the work I'd completed that day. Luna was sitting on our expensive leather couch that I'd helped her pick out 6 months earlier, the one she'd insisted would create the perfect backdrop for lifestyle photos she planned to incorporate into her brand development strategy. She was scrolling through her phone with that focused intensity she usually reserved for analyzing engagement metrics on her posts or researching trending hashtags in the food blogging community. When I walked through the door, she barely looked up from the screen, offering only a distracted greeting that felt more like an acknowledgement of my presence than genuine interest in how my day had gone or whether I needed anything after my marathon debugging session. I heated up leftover soup from the expensive organic market she preferred and sat down beside her on the couch, hoping we might have a normal conversation about our respective days or maybe watch something together like we used to do before her career ambitions began consuming every spare moment of her attention. Instead, she set down her phone with the deliberate precision of someone who'd been rehearsing what they were about to say and turned to face me with an expression I'd never seen before but immediately recognized as the look of someone preparing to deliver news that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of our shared life. She told me she'd been doing a lot of thinking about our relationship and where it was heading, using the careful tone people adopt when they're trying to soften the impact of devastating news by presenting it as a mutual discussion rather than a unilateral decision they've already made. Luna explained that she'd been feeling creatively suffocated and needed space to explore whether our partnership aligned with her authentic culinary journey, a phrase that sounded like something she'd pulled from one of those self-help articles about following your passion that kept appearing in her browser bookmarks. She claimed she needed to rediscover her passion without domestic obligations weighing her down, describing our shared life as a series of constraints that were preventing her from fully embracing the opportunities that were opening up through her expanding network of industry connections and potential collaborators. The way she presented her request made it sound like a temporary break designed to help her gain clarity about what she wanted from life, but something in her tone suggested this was less about exploration and more about creating distance from something she'd already decided wasn't working for her long-term goals and personal growth trajectory. When I asked for specifics about what kind of space she needed and how long this exploration might take, she suggested I move out for 6 weeks while she figured out whether our relationship was compatible with the person she was becoming through her professional development and creative awakening. The request hit me like a physical blow, not just because of what she was asking but because of the casual way she delivered it, as if she were discussing weekend plans rather than dismantling 2 years of shared life and future planning that had shaped every decision I'd made since we'd moved in together. I sat there processing her words while she continued explaining how this break would benefit both of us, how it would give me time to think about whether I really wanted to be with someone whose career demanded flexibility and understanding of the creative process rather than the predictable routine I seemed to prefer. She talked about rediscovering her authentic self without the pressure of maintaining domestic harmony or accommodating someone else's schedule and expectations, painting our relationship as a burden that was preventing her from reaching her full potential as both an artist and entrepreneur in Portland's competitive culinary landscape. What she didn't tell me, what I wouldn't discover until much later, was that she'd already been texting Asher, a pretentious sous chef from one of Portland's most exclusive restaurants who'd been promising to help her expand her palate in ways that went far beyond professional networking and culinary education. Asher represented everything she thought was missing from our relationship: spontaneous creativity, industry connections, and the kind of passionate intensity she associated with authentic artistic expression rather than the stable partnership we'd been building together. While she spoke about needing creative space and time for self-discovery, she was actually planning to explore a relationship with someone who embodied the exciting, unpredictable lifestyle she'd convinced herself she needed to feel fulfilled and alive. I responded with surprising calm, telling her to take all the time she needed, maintaining my composure even though I felt like something essential was breaking apart inside my chest. I didn't argue or beg or try to convince her that we could work through whatever was making her feel trapped, partly because I was too shocked to formulate a coherent response and partly because some instinct told me that arguing would only confirm her belief that I was the kind of person who tried to control situations rather than allowing them to unfold naturally. Instead, I stood up and began gathering my belongings with the same methodical approach I brought to solving complex technical problems, treating this as a logistical challenge rather than an emotional crisis that was reshaping my understanding of everything I thought we'd built together. Luna seemed surprised by my measured response, as if she'd expected tears or anger or desperate pleas that would have made her feel important and desired rather than simply accommodated in her decision to disrupt our shared life. I found myself crashing in my college friend Marcus's guest room for what I assumed would be a temporary arrangement while Luna conducted her creative exploration, but within 48 hours of moving out, I received an unexpected text message that would completely change my perspective on the situation and introduce me to someone who would help me understand what genuine care actually looked like. The message came from Iris, Luna's 25-year-old cousin who worked as a pediatric nurse at Oregon Health and Science University, someone Luna had always dismissed as too practical and conventional to understand the artistic temperament required for creative success in Portland's competitive food scene. Iris reached out without taking sides in what she assumed was temporary relationship drama, simply offering support and suggesting we meet for coffee at a quiet neighborhood cafe where we could talk openly about what I was going through without judgment or unsolicited advice about how to fix things with someone who clearly wasn't ready to appreciate what I brought to the relationship. I almost declined her invitation, partly because I felt embarrassed about the entire situation and partly because I wasn't sure I wanted to discuss my personal problems with someone who was essentially a stranger, but something in her message conveyed genuine warmth and concern that made me reconsider my instinct to isolate myself while processing Luna's devastating request. When we met at the small coffee shop she'd chosen, a cozy place with mismatched furniture and local art covering the walls, I was immediately struck by how different Iris was from her cousin in ways that went far beyond their contrasting career choices and lifestyle preferences. Where Luna commanded attention through carefully curated beauty and dramatic flair, Iris possessed a quiet confidence that put people at ease without demanding anything in return, the kind of presence that made complicated situations feel manageable through steady competence rather than theatrical gestures or philosophical declarations about authenticity. She listened to my explanation of recent events with the kind of focused attention I remembered from the early days of my relationship with Luna, asking thoughtful questions that showed she was genuinely interested in understanding my perspective rather than gathering information to share with other family members or forming judgments about who was right or wrong in what she recognized as a complicated emotional situation. Our conversation flowed naturally from my work in software testing to her passion for helping sick children, revealing shared values of reliability, genuine care for others, and the belief that meaningful work involved making people's lives better in concrete, measurable ways rather than pursuing recognition or personal fulfillment at the expense of practical responsibilities and commitments to other people. Iris appreciated qualities in me that Luna had begun treating as character flaws, particularly my stability and attention to detail, calling me exactly the type of person who makes the world better through quiet competence and consistent reliability that allows other people to flourish without worrying about whether basic systems will function when they need them most. She seemed genuinely impressed when I described the technical problems I solved at work, asking follow-up questions about how restaurant systems functioned and expressing real interest in the methodical approach required to debug complex software issues that could affect thousands of customers across multiple locations if not addressed properly and efficiently. Within a week, we were sharing meals and taking long walks through Forest Park, discovering compatibility in areas where Luna and I had struggled to find common ground despite my efforts to bridge differences that she increasingly treated as fundamental incompatibilities rather than normal relationship challenges that required patience and communication to resolve. Iris enjoyed planning weekend activities and appreciated my tendency to research restaurants and hiking trails in advance, treating my organizational skills as helpful rather than constraining, understanding that preparation enhanced rather than limited spontaneous enjoyment of experiences we shared together. She never made me feel like my preference for structure and predictability was somehow limiting her personal growth or preventing her from embracing spontaneous opportunities for adventure and self-discovery, recognizing that different approaches to life could complement each other rather than competing for dominance in a relationship between equals. For the first time in months, I felt valued and respected for who I actually was rather than criticized for who I wasn't, and I began to understand the difference between supporting someone's dreams and being expected to subsidize their fantasy of living without practical constraints or adult responsibilities that everyone else managed to integrate with their creative aspirations. Meanwhile, Luna was diving headfirst into her creative exploration with Asher, the pretentious sous chef who represented everything she thought she'd been missing in our stable, supportive relationship, someone who talked about food the way other people discussed religion or politics, with passionate intensity that masked a fundamental selfishness disguised as artistic vision. She began posting dramatic Instagram stories about breaking free from conventional relationships and discovering what authentic passion actually felt like when you stopped settling for comfortable familiarity and started embracing the uncertainty that came with genuine artistic growth and creative risk-taking that most people were too afraid to pursue. Her blog content became increasingly erratic as she focused more energy on documenting her personal transformation than maintaining the consistent posting schedule that had been building her following and attracting potential sponsors who expected reliable content delivery rather than philosophical musings about authenticity that had little to do with food photography or restaurant reviews. I watched from a distance as her carefully constructed online brand began showing cracks, with sponsored posts becoming less frequent and engagement dropping as her content shifted from food photography and restaurant reviews to philosophical reflections about authenticity that seemed disconnected from her original mission of sharing culinary discoveries with fellow food enthusiasts who followed her for practical recommendations rather than abstract theories about creative expression. The irony wasn't lost on me that while she was pursuing what she considered a more passionate and creative lifestyle, the practical foundation I'd provided was exactly what had allowed her to build the platform she was now neglecting in favor of dramatic personal revelations that meant more to her than to her audience, who began unfollowing as her content became less useful and more self-indulgent. Iris and I discussed these developments during our evening walks, Not from a place of vindictive satisfaction, but with the kind of analytical perspective that helped me understand patterns of behavior I'd been too close to recognize while living through them, gaining clarity that came from emotional distance and the perspective of someone who valued stability and consistency. She pointed out how Luna's pursuit of authentic experiences often seemed to involve abandoning responsibility rather than integrating passion with practical considerations, a pattern that extended beyond our relationship to her approach to work, family obligations, and financial planning that had been masked by my willingness to handle details she found boring or constraining rather than learning to balance creativity with accountability. Through our conversations, I realized that Luna's idea of creative freedom was actually dependence disguised as independence, requiring someone else to handle practical matters while she pursued experiences that felt meaningful to her without consideration for how they affected the people who cared about her or supported her ambitions through tangible contributions rather than emotional validation and philosophical agreement about the importance of following your passion. 3 weeks into Luna's period of creative exploration, her carefully constructed fantasy began crumbling in ways that were both predictable and deeply satisfying to observe from a safe distance. Asher, the pretentious sous chef who had promised to revolutionize her understanding of authentic culinary experiences, disappeared completely after a disastrous pop-up dinner event where Luna's food photography skills were publicly criticized by industry veterans who questioned whether she understood the difference between artistic composition and practical documentation that restaurants needed for marketing purposes. The criticism wasn't entirely unfair, as her recent work had become increasingly focused on dramatic lighting and abstract angles that obscured rather than showcased the actual dishes, prioritizing aesthetic mood over the clear, appetizing images that food companies required for promotional campaigns and dining enthusiasts wanted for making informed restaurant choices. Her blog began losing several sponsored partnerships as brands discovered she was missing deadlines and delivering inconsistent content quality while distracted by romantic drama and philosophical soul-searching that had nothing to do with the professional reliability they expected from influencer collaborations that required consistent audience engagement. The food companies that had been paying her to feature their products started working with bloggers who could maintain consistent posting schedules and deliver content that actually promoted their brands rather than serving as vehicles for personal revelations about authenticity and creative freedom that meant nothing to potential customers. Friends from Portland's food scene began distancing themselves after witnessing her entitled behavior during networking events and her constant complaints about her boring ex-boyfriend who didn't understand the artistic vision required to succeed in competitive creative fields where passion mattered more than conventional stability. She had apparently spent considerable time at industry gatherings explaining how she'd outgrown someone who valued security over passion, not realizing that her audience consisted largely of people who had built successful careers by combining creativity with business acumen and professional responsibility rather than treating artistic expression as an excuse to abandon practical obligations. Luna attempted to reconnect with me through increasingly desperate text messages that revealed just how completely her life was unraveling without the stable foundation I had provided, starting with casual check-ins that pretended nothing significant had changed and escalating to lengthy paragraphs about how she'd gained perspective on what really mattered in relationships through her period of self-discovery. Her initial messages maintained the confident tone she'd adopted when requesting space to explore her authentic self, but as weeks passed without meaningful response from me, her communications became more vulnerable and eventually desperate, acknowledging that she might have made errors in judgment while still avoiding direct responsibility for the specific ways she'd damaged our relationship through selfishness and manipulation. She began claiming that our relationship had actually been perfect and that her period of exploration had helped her realize how much she valued the stability and support I'd provided, though she framed this realization as personal growth rather than acknowledgement of the mistakes she'd made or the hurt she'd caused through her selfish pursuit of excitement over commitment to someone who had consistently supported her dreams. I, meanwhile, was confidently dating Iris and genuinely happy for the first time in months, experiencing what it felt like to be with someone who appreciated rather than criticized my fundamental character traits and who contributed equally to our shared experiences rather than expecting to be subsidized financially and emotionally while pursuing personal fulfillment at my expense. I had discovered the profound relief that came from being with someone whose idea of adventure involved planning weekend trips to explore new hiking trails rather than abandoning practical responsibilities in pursuit of undefined, authentic experiences that seemed to require hurting other people and treating their support as an obligation rather than a gift freely given. My relationship with Iris felt effortless in ways that my partnership with Luna never had, built on mutual respect and genuine compatibility rather than my one-sided effort to accommodate someone else's increasingly unreasonable expectations and dramatic personality changes that she attributed to artistic growth but which looked more like self-centered immaturity from any objective perspective. I maintained polite but firm boundaries when responding to Luna's attempts at reconciliation, refusing to engage with her manipulation tactics or provide the emotional support she was seeking now that her exciting new lifestyle had revealed itself to be unsustainable without someone else handling practical details and financial responsibility that she had taken for granted while pursuing her creative dreams. Her family members began reaching out to guilt-trip me into giving her another chance, sharing stories about how devastated she was and how much she regretted her decisions, but I maintained my position with newfound self-respect that had been strengthened through my relationship with someone who valued my contributions rather than taking them for granted while demanding ever more support and accommodation. I had learned through experience with Iris that healthy relationships didn't require constant negotiation about fundamental values or exhausting efforts to prove your worth to someone who treated your care as an obligation rather than a gift. And I wasn't interested in returning to the emotional exhaustion that had characterized my final months with Luna when she had begun viewing my stability as a constraint rather than an asset. The contrast between Luna's desperate attempts to regain control of a situation that had spiraled beyond her management and Iris's steady appreciation for the life we were building together made it crystal clear which path led toward genuine happiness rather than dramatic intensity that felt meaningful in the moment but created ongoing instability and dissatisfaction that required someone else to manage while she pursued experiences that felt authentic to her without consideration for their impact on people who cared about her. The final confrontation between Luna and myself occurred at the annual family Christmas Eve gathering at Iris's parents' spacious home in Beaverton, a warm and welcoming place where her extended family had been hosting holiday celebrations for over 20 years. The gathering represented everything I'd always imagined family holidays could be, with genuine laughter echoing from the kitchen where multiple generations worked together preparing traditional dishes, children playing board games in the living room, and adults engaged in meaningful conversations that didn't revolve around social media metrics or career advancement strategies designed to impress strangers on the internet. Iris had invited me to join her family's celebration after we'd been dating for several months, and I felt genuinely honored to be included in their close-knit tradition, especially knowing that her parents had been carefully evaluating whether I was worthy of their daughter's affection and trust rather than simply accepting anyone who showed up with flowers and charming conversation. The evening had been proceeding beautifully, with Iris's family welcoming me with the kind of warmth that made it clear they valued substance over superficial charm, appreciating my genuine interest in their stories and my obvious care for Iris rather than demanding impressive credentials or exciting anecdotes about unconventional lifestyle choices that sounded adventurous but lacked practical substance. I was helping Iris's mother arrange appetizers in the kitchen when we heard a car door slam in the driveway, followed by the sound of heels clicking rapidly across the front porch in a rhythm that suggested urgency bordering on desperation rather than the calm confidence of someone arriving at a planned gathering. When the doorbell rang, followed immediately by aggressive knocking that indicated someone who wasn't planning to wait patiently for a response, the entire family exchanged glances that conveyed both surprise and concern about who would arrive uninvited to an intimate family gathering on Christmas Eve without understanding how inappropriate such behavior was during a sacred family tradition. Iris opened the door to reveal Luna standing on the porch, visibly distressed and clearly having driven directly from somewhere else without considering whether her arrival would be welcome or appropriate given the circumstances and the fact that she'd spent months criticizing the very family values that were being celebrated inside this warm, comfortable home. Luna's appearance shocked everyone present, not just because she looked dramatically different from the confident, polished person I remembered, but because she'd obviously been crying and appeared to have lost considerable weight in a way that suggested stress rather than intentional health improvement or the kind of transformation she'd been posting about on social media. She was alone, which struck me as particularly sad given how much she'd always emphasized the importance of social connections and networking relationships that were supposed to provide the authentic experiences she claimed were missing from our conventional partnership built on boring things like reliability and mutual support. When Luna spotted me standing beside Iris near the fireplace, clearly comfortable and integrated into the family gathering in ways that demonstrated genuine belonging rather than awkward toleration of someone's temporary boyfriend, her composure shattered completely and she immediately demanded a private conversation with the kind of entitled urgency that suggested she still believed her needs should take priority over everyone else's comfort and peace during their most important annual tradition. I calmly but firmly declined her request for privacy, explaining that anything she needed to communicate could be said in front of Iris's family, who had already welcomed me into their circle and deserved to understand what was happening in their living room during their most important annual celebration where multiple generations had gathered to share love and gratitude rather than drama and confrontation. Luna's response revealed everything about her character that I'd been too close to see clearly during our relationship, as she publicly accused me of betraying family loyalty by dating her cousin and abandoning someone who truly understood my potential for growth and transformation through exposure to creative experiences that would have made me a more interesting and dynamic person. The accusation was particularly ironic given that she'd been the one to request space for exploration and had been secretly communicating with Asher long before asking me to move out. But she seemed genuinely convinced that I was somehow obligated to remain available for her eventual return despite her clear rejection of everything I represented and her public dismissal of the values that had made our relationship functional. Her public meltdown escalated when she screamed that I was nothing without her support and that Iris was just a rebound who would never understand creative passion or appreciate the artistic vision that she'd been trying to help me develop through exposure to Portland's dynamic culinary scene and the sophisticated people who understood that conventional success was less important than authentic self-expression. The entire extended family witnessed Luna's complete inability to accept responsibility for the consequences of her choices, as she demanded that I stop what she called this charade of happiness and return to our real relationship, which she claimed was the only authentic connection either of us would ever experience because we shared a deeper understanding of creativity and passion that couldn't be replicated with someone as conventional as Iris. Uncle Marcus, who had previously supported Luna during family discussions and had always appreciated her enthusiasm and creative energy when she attended family gatherings in the past, visibly cringed as she threatened to expose my supposed character flaws to everyone present, revealing intimate details about our relationship that demonstrated her willingness to weaponize private moments when she didn't get her way or when reality failed to match her expectations. The most disturbing aspect of her behavior was how completely she'd convinced herself that everyone else was wrong and that her perspective represented the only valid interpretation of recent events, treating my obvious happiness with Iris as some kind of elaborate performance designed to hurt her rather than genuine contentment with someone who appreciated my fundamental character rather than trying to transform it into something more exciting and unpredictable. When Luna realized that her emotional manipulation wasn't working and that neither I nor Iris's family was willing to validate her version of events, she began making increasingly desperate threats about what would happen if I didn't stop this ridiculous charade and return to the only relationship that had ever truly mattered in my life. She claimed that I was making the biggest mistake possible by choosing basic stability over brilliant creativity, warning that I would regret settling for someone who would never challenge me to grow or become the person I was meant to be through exposure to authentic experiences that transcended conventional expectations about what relationships should provide. Her final desperate attempt at control involved threatening to tell everyone present about all the ways I'd supposedly failed as a boyfriend and partner, claiming she had evidence of character flaws that would make Iris's family understand why I wasn't worthy of their daughter's love and respect. However, her threat backfired completely because everyone in that room had already observed my genuine care for Iris and my respectful integration into their family traditions, making Luna's accusations sound like the desperate lies of someone who couldn't accept that her former partner had found happiness without her guidance and support. Iris's parents quietly but firmly asked Luna to leave after she continued disrupting their family celebration with increasingly desperate threats and accusations, but even their polite firmness couldn't penetrate her conviction that she was the wronged party in a situation entirely of her own creation. Someone whose only mistake had been believing that I was capable of growth and transformation that would have made our relationship truly extraordinary rather than merely functional and stable. I delivered my calm but devastating final response to Luna while the entire room watched in stunned silence, explaining that her creative space had given me the absolute clarity to recognize her selfishness and manipulation for what they truly were, and that I was genuinely grateful she had pushed me away because it allowed me to discover what authentic appreciation actually felt like when shared with someone who valued stability over drama and real substance over theatrical gestures. I told her that Iris represented everything Luna lacked: genuine kindness, emotional maturity, and the ability to build people up rather than tear them down in pursuit of some undefined vision of authentic living that seemed to require making everyone else miserable in service of her personal growth and artistic expression that never actually resulted in meaningful creative output or professional success. Luna's face went through several expressions as she processed my words, shifting from shocked disbelief to fury to something that looked like genuine panic as she realized that her final attempt at manipulation had not only failed but had actually strengthened my resolve to move forward without her dramatic presence in my life, which had been exhausting rather than inspiring despite her claims about bringing excitement and creative energy to our partnership. She attempted one last desperate threat, claiming that I would regret choosing basic over brilliant when I inevitably became bored with Iris's conventional approach to life and longed for the excitement and creative stimulation that only she could provide through her sophisticated understanding of what made experiences truly meaningful and transformative rather than merely comfortable, predictable, and ultimately unsatisfying. The threat fell flat in front of an audience that had just witnessed her complete emotional breakdown and inability to accept responsibility for the consequences of her own choices, making her warnings sound like the empty promises of someone who had fundamentally misunderstood what constituted genuine excitement versus manufactured drama designed to create the illusion of depth and passion without the substance necessary to build lasting relationships or successful careers. Luna stormed out after delivering one final declaration that I would never find anyone who understood my potential the way she did, slamming the door behind her with enough force to rattle the windows and leaving the family gathering in a stunned silence that was quickly filled with expressions of support and bewilderment at her behavior from people who had never witnessed such a dramatic display of entitlement and emotional manipulation in their warm, stable family environment. The aftermath of her dramatic exit revealed the complete emotional freedom I felt for the first time in years, as Iris's family rallied around us with warmth and understanding that demonstrated how healthy relationships actually functioned when people prioritized genuine care over performative displays of passion and creativity that demanded constant validation and accommodation from everyone else in their orbit. Iris and I continued building our relationship based on mutual respect and shared values, planning a spring trip to visit her nursing school friends in Sacramento while discussing our hopes for a future that included marriage, children, and the kind of stable happiness that Luna had always dismissed as boring but which felt like the greatest adventure possible when shared with someone who appreciated rather than criticized your fundamental character traits and life choices. Luna's food blog ultimately failed as her reputation in Portland's food scene suffered from her erratic behavior and inability to maintain professional relationships with sponsors, restaurants, and fellow influencers who expected consistency and reliability rather than philosophical manifestos about authenticity that had nothing to do with promoting their brands or providing useful content to their target audiences. I thrived in both my career and personal life, finally understanding that I deserved someone who saw my worth from the beginning rather than treating me like a project that required constant improvement and transformation to become worthy of their attention and affection, someone who expected me to change my fundamental nature to match their ever-shifting definition of what constituted an interesting and dynamic partner. The contrast between Luna's chaotic pursuit of authentic experiences and the genuine contentment I found with Iris made it crystal clear that the most profound happiness came not from dramatic intensity or creative stimulation, but from the daily choice to build something lasting with someone who valued stability, kindness, and the unglamorous work of creating a life together based on mutual support rather than one-sided sacrifice disguised as romantic devotion or artistic partnership that demanded constant accommodation. 6 months later, when mutual friends occasionally mention Luna's continued struggles with finding direction in her career and personal life, including failed attempts to restart her blog and repeated conflicts with former industry contacts who had grown tired of her unpredictable behavior and entitled attitude, I felt only distant sympathy for someone who had convinced herself that happiness required constant excitement and validation rather than the deeper satisfaction that came from appreciating what you already had and working to nurture it rather than abandoning it in pursuit of something that seemed more exciting but lacked the solid foundation necessary for lasting fulfillment and genuine partnership between two people who actually respected each other's contributions to their shared life.